Picture this. You're slogging uphill through slick mud, packed shoulder to shoulder with 5,000 other Scottish soldiers. The sky darkens overhead. Then it happens. A black cloud of English arrows begins to fall. Instinct takes over. You drop your chin, trying to hide your face behind the rim of your steel helmet. That split-second reflex seals your fate. By tilting your head forward, you pull the chainmail aventail tight against your throat. You create a tiny gap, barely an inch, between your armor and the base of your skull. One heavy bodkin arrow, falling almost straight down, finds it. The impact is surgical. Your spinal cord is severed instantly. You collapse face first into the mud. You're not dead. Not yet. You're paralyzed, fully conscious, staring at the ground while the next volley wipes out the men behind you. This kind of precise mechanical cruelty defined the Battle of Halidon Hill. Before we break down how this massacre rewrote the rules of warfare forever, if you enjoy dissecting the grim mechanics of history, hit like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments which battle you think was the most unjust. I read everyone. To understand why Halidon Hill happened, we have to strip away the romance of medieval chivalry. It's the year 1333. England is a humiliated power. 19 years earlier, at Bannockburn, the Scots shattered the English army, annihilating their heavy cavalry in a single afternoon. The defeat was so total it forced England to sign the Treaty of Northampton, formally recognizing Scottish independence. But England now has a new king. Edward III is 20 years old, cold-eyed, pragmatic, and obsessed with revenge. He despises the memory of his father's failure. More importantly, he understands something his predecessors didn't. The traditional English way of war, charging on horseback in search of glory, is obsolete. It failed at Bannockburn. It would fail again. So Edward changes the rules. He looks at the English longbow, a weapon aristocrats sneer at as a poacher's tool, and sees something else entirely. He sees a medieval machine gun. He realizes that massed archery, combined with a strong defensive position, can erase the need for heroic charges altogether. He doesn't need to chase the Scots. He can let physics kill them. What he needs is a testing ground. He chooses Berwick upon Tweed. Edward marches north not to conquer, but to provoke. He besieges Berwick with a brutality that shocks even hardened contemporaries. Supply lines are cut. Infrastructure is destroyed. The city is slowly strangled into a humanitarian disaster. Edward knows exactly what this will do. The Scots will be forced to respond. And they do. The Guardian of Scotland, Archibald Douglas, marches south with a massive army, confident in numbers and buoyed by past victories. He expects swords, courage, and momentum to decide the day. He doesn't realize he's walking straight into a solved equation. Edward positions his army on Halidon Hill. He orders his knights to dismount, unthinkable by medieval standards, and stand shoulder to shoulder with common archers. He uses the terrain to funnel the Scots into mud and narrow approaches. Then he waits. This isn't just the story of a battle. It's the story of how a young king turned war into an industrial process, and how an army marched willingly into the grinder. The road to Halidon Hill didn't start with trumpets or border raids. It began in the shadows of the English court, whispered into existence by a group of angry men known as the Disinherited. These weren't peasants or mercenaries. They were members of the Anglo-Scottish elite, men like Henry de Beaumont and David Strathbogie, who had lost vast estates when Robert the Bruce consolidated his rule. For years, they lingered in England, clinging to empty titles and burning with resentment. To them, The Treaty of Northampton wasn't peace. It was a lock on the door to their own homes. Edward saw opportunity. He wanted Scotland, but he couldn't openly invade without breaking his oath and angering the Pope. The disinherited offered a workaround, a proxy war. If they failed, Edward could disown them as rogue adventurers. If they succeeded, they'd owe him everything. At the center of this scheme stood Edward Balliol, the son of a former Scottish king, armed with a legitimate but fragile claim to the throne. He was the perfect figurehead. In 1332, Edward quietly allowed Balliol and the disinherited to gather ships in Yorkshire. Publicly, he forbade any breach of peace. Privately, he watched them sail. What followed was the rehearsal for Halidon Hill. At Duplin Moor, roughly 1,500 disinherited adventurers faced a Scottish army estimated anywhere between 15,000 and 40,000 men. By every traditional measure, it should have been a slaughter. Instead, it became a demonstration. Henry de Beaumont, the tactical mind behind the force, made a radical choice. He dismounted his knights. He formed them into a solid block of infantry and placed longbowmen on the flanks. When the Scots charged, expecting cavalry, they were funneled into a deadly corridor. Arrows drove them inward. Men-at-arms held the line. Thousands of Scots were crushed and butchered in place. The Earl of Mar was killed. The Scottish army collapsed. Edward Balliol was crowned King of Scots at Scone, but his reign was a joke. He ruled a hostile land with no real support. Within months, Scottish loyalists struck back. In a nighttime raid at Annan, they caught Balliol asleep. The self-proclaimed King of Scotland escaped by smashing through his own bedroom wall, fleeing half-naked on a cart horse, wearing only a shirt and one boot. He crossed back into England, humiliated, desperate, and begging for help. That was the moment Edward III had been waiting for. Balliol's failure didn't end the plan. It perfected it. Edward III now had exactly what he needed: a rightful king who had been illegally overthrown. The Treaty of Northampton was effectively dead. Edward could march north not as a conqueror, but as a protector restoring lawful order. It was legal theater, and everyone understood the script. Edward welcomed Balliol back, dressed him, fed him, and then slid a document across the table. The terms were brutal. In exchange for English military support, Balliol agreed to permanently surrender the entire southern portion of Scotland to England. To save his crown, he signed away the kingdom. With the ink dry, the mask came off. Edward mobilized the full English state. Writs of array went out across the realm, summoning archers from Sherwood, the Welsh marches, and every county with yew trees and strong backs. This wasn't a mercenary raid anymore. This was a national army. The objective was simple: Berwick upon Tweed. Edward reached the city in May of 1333 and established his camp on Halidon Hill, overlooking the walls. He had the high ground. He had the longbow. And thanks to Balliol, he had justification. Berwick was the crown jewel of the north. A wealthy port city, thick with merchants and customs revenue, it sat awkwardly on the northern bank of the Tweed. Isolated, rich, and exposed. Edward didn't come to negotiate. He came to suffocate. By late May, the siege works were complete. A massive ditch and earthen rampart sealed off the landward side of the city. At sea, English ships blockaded the river mouth, their masts forming a floating wall. Nothing got in. No food. No relief. Inside Berwick, reality collapsed quickly. Governor Alexander Seton watched as trebuchets and mangonels pounded the walls day and night. But stone wasn't the real enemy. Hunger was. The horses went first, then the dogs. Rats followed. Disease crept through the alleys. By early summer, Berwick was dying. Archibald Douglas, now guardian of Scotland, knew the clock was ticking. He had gathered a massive host, perhaps 15,000 men, but he hesitated. Attacking a dug-in English army on high ground was madness, but losing Berwick would shatter his authority. So Douglas tried to be clever. Instead of marching to Berwick, he marched south, deep into England. He burned villages, slaughtered livestock, and spread terror through Northumberland. The logic was sound. Force Edward to abandon the siege and chase him. He escalated further. Douglas marched on Bamburgh Castle, where Edward's wife, Queen Philippa, was staying. He laid siege to the Queen herself. Against almost any medieval king, this would have worked. Edward didn't move. When messengers arrived reporting the devastation and the danger to his wife, Edward simply looked toward the smoke on the southern horizon and refused to budge. He calculated that Bamburgh could hold. Berwick was worth more. This cold patience terrified the Scots. They realized Edward would not blink. Back in Berwick, hope evaporated. On July 15th, with food gone and walls failing, Seaton requested terms. The agreement was precise. If the Scottish army did not relieve the city by sunset on July 19th, Berwick would surrender. But relief was defined narrowly. 200 Scottish men-at-arms had to fight their way through the English lines and enter the city. Edward signed with a smile. Douglas was trapped. He could no longer raid. He could no longer delay. To save Berwick and his reputation, he had to attack Halidon Hill head-on. As the Scottish army rushed north, Edward twisted the knife. As part of the agreement, Seaton had given his son, Thomas, as a hostage. When disputes arose over whether Berwick had technically been relieved, Edward declared the terms broken. He ordered a gallows built, not in the camp, but directly in view of the city walls. Sir Alexander Seaton and his wife watched as English soldiers led their son up the scaffold. There was no reprieve, no mercy. Thomas Seaton was hanged as a signal that Edward was finished negotiating. Chivalry died on that gallows. The execution detonated the situation. The defenders inside Berwick hardened their resolve. Outside the city, Douglas arrived just in time to see or hear the aftermath. He had no options left. Turning away now meant political death. Attacking meant military disaster. Rage drowned reason. Douglas looked up at Halidon Hill. The English deployment was perfect. Edward had divided his army into 3 battles, standing like a steel wall along the crest. To reach them, the Scots would have to descend their own ridge, cross a marshy valley known as the Bog, and then climb 500 yards of steep slope, under fire. Edward had left the approach open on purpose. Douglas convened a council. Younger nobles demanded an attack. They pointed to their numbers, nearly double the English. They invoked Bannockburn. They ignored one crucial detail. At Bannockburn, the English had attacked. Douglas gave the order. The Scots dismounted, forming massive schiltrons, dense blocks of spearmen bristling with 12-foot pikes. The plan was brutally simple. March through the bog, endure the arrows, and smash into the English line by sheer mass. As the columns descended, the sky remained clear. The English stood silent. No horns, no cries, just the creak of bow staves and shifting armor. Douglas stepped into the marsh. The mud grabbed his boots. Water rose to his shins. The trap closed. While Douglas made an emotional decision, Edward finalized a mechanical one. Standing atop Halidon Hill, he did something almost heretical. He grounded the aristocracy. Every knight was ordered off his horse. The destriers were sent to the rear. In one command, Edward removed glory, mobility, and retreat. Knights and peasants would stand and die together if necessary. The message was unmistakable. This line would not break. Edward arranged his army into 3 divisions, himself in the center, flanked by Thomas of Norfolk and Edward Balliol. But the real genius was on the wings. Instead of placing archers behind the infantry, Edward pushed them forward and outward, forming V-shaped wedges on each flank. This created deadly crossfire funnels. Any attacker advancing on the center would be struck from the front and both sides simultaneously. It was enfilade fire, arrows bypassing shields and finding armpits, necks, and joints. The longbowmen were professionals, men shaped by the bow since childhood. Each carried nearly 50 arrows. Each drew over 100 pounds of yew and sinew. From the hilltop, they watched the Scottish columns compress as they struggled through the bog. Edward had turned the battlefield into a conveyor belt, and the Scots were already on it. The ground did most of the killing. From their ridge at Witch's Knowe, the Scottish army looked down at Halidon Hill and saw an enemy that refused to move. The distance wasn't great, less than a mile, but the terrain in between was a trap shaped by geology. To reach the English line, the Scots had to descend their own slope, cross a valley floor of soaked peat, and then climb a long, punishing incline straight into prepared defenses. Archibald Douglas ordered the schiltrons forward. At first, the formations held. Thousands of spears moved as one. But the moment iron-shod boots hit the bog, everything unraveled. The ground wasn't firm. It swallowed feet, twisted ankles, and broke rhythm. Men slipped. Spears turned into balancing poles. Instinct drove them closer together. That instinct killed them. A schiltron needs space to function. As the marsh forced the Scots to compress, the formation lost its ability to fight. The men became a single, struggling mass, focused on staying upright rather than advancing. The gaps between divisions blurred. The army began to choke itself. From the crest of Halidon Hill, Edward watched the transformation with cold clarity. He saw steam rise from exhausted bodies. He saw momentum bleed away. The Scots were now fully committed, stuck in the open, and moving at a crawl. They had entered the kill zone. As the vanguard dragged itself out of the bog, reality got worse. The slope ahead was steep. Legs already burning from the marsh now screamed in protest. Breath fogged inside helmets, and they were still hundreds of yards away. Edward waited. In medieval warfare, archery wasn't about precision. It was about saturation. You didn't aim for a man. You aimed for a space and made it lethal. When the Scots were close enough that retreat was impossible, Edward gave the signal. 5,000 longbowmen stepped forward in unison. Left feet planted, bows raised, strings drawn back to the ear. The sound rolled across the hill like timber tearing apart in a storm. They loosed. The arrows climbed high, blotting out the sun, then fell straight down in plunging fire. Gravity finished the work muscle began. The impacts were wet, not metallic. Men didn't fall. They vanished. Arrows punched through mail, thighs, shoulders, and feet, pinning bodies to the slope. Still, the Scots came on. They lowered their heads and raised shields, trying to weather the storm. That's when Edward's geometry finished them. The archers on the flanks raked the columns from the sides. Shields became useless. Arrows found armpits, necks, and the backs of legs. The formation slowed to a shuffle. Then it stopped. The men behind kept pushing. The men in front couldn't move. The pressure built until soldiers were lifted off their feet, ribs cracking, lungs crushed. Many died without a single English blade touching them. Those who reached the English line were already broken, exhausted, wounded, terrified. The dismounted English men-at-arms stepped forward and ended it with pole-axes and hammers. It wasn't a fight, it was cleanup. Then the line broke. Once the Scots realized the front was gone, survival took over. Spears were dropped, shields abandoned. Men turned and fled, back into the bog. That's when Edward unleashed the cavalry. The English knights mounted and rode down the slope into a mass of exhausted fugitives. Edward gave a command rarely issued in medieval war. No quarter. There would be no ransoms, no prisoners. This wasn't about money. It was about erasing leadership. The pursuit lasted miles. Archibald Douglas was found dead among the bodies. 6 earls, dozens of barons, hundreds of knights. A generation of Scottish command was wiped out in an afternoon. English losses were negligible. As the sun set on July 19th, Berwick surrendered. The field below Halidon Hill was no longer green. It was a carpet of corpses bristling with arrows. Edward had done more than win a battle. He had proven a system. Halidon Hill was the laboratory. Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt were the final products. The mounted knight charging into glory was obsolete. Discipline, terrain, and technology had replaced heroism. For Scotland, the defeat was catastrophic, but not final. The nation endured. Guerrilla war continued. The puppet king failed, but the lesson remains. Archibald Douglas wasn't stupid. He fought the war he understood. Edward fought the war that existed, and that difference decided everything. Thank you for watching.